This video is on the central nervous system. Remember that the nervous system consists of two major divisions. The central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the brain. If you look at the central nervous system, particularly the brain, you will notice this pattern of gray and white matter. Now remember, we said that white matter consists of mainly myelinated axons, some unmyelinated, but mainly myelinated axons. And it's responsible for communication. So kind of think of the white matter as telephone lines from the cerebral cortex to other parts of the nervous system. Gray matter is mostly neuron cell bodies. So if we start at the higher brain areas such as the cerebellum, and here we have a transverse section, you can see that there is this outer layer of gray. Now in this picture, it's showing you a brown, kind of a brown color. And because that's the color of the dissected brain since it's in formaldehyde. But we have this outer gray area. In a living brain, it really is gray. And this is called the cortex. Remember, the cortex means the outside of an organ. Under the gray matter is white matter, and under the white matter is another layer of gray matter, and then in the middle you have a central cavity with cerebral spinal fluid. If we go a little bit lower in the CNS, so now we're looking at the brainstem, you'll see there is no outer gray cortex. Now I know this looks kind of gray here, but it's not. So we have white on the outside, then gray matter, then again the central cavity with the cerebral spinal fluid. If we go even lower in the CNS and look at the spinal cord, again there is no outer gray cortex. So it's white matter on the outside, gray matter, even though it has a kind of funny shape here, and then a central cavity with cerebral spinal fluid. So this pattern of gray, white, gray is kind of consistent through most of the nervous system. Now you will notice that sometimes in the white matter there's a little bit of gray matter, and these are called nuclei. Now remember, nuclei are groups of cell bodies found within the CNS, and that's what these are. Now one example of nuclei is called the basal nuclei, and we're going to look at this a little closely because there are many nuclei within the CNS, and each group of nuclei has been identified and it's known what the function is. So to give you an example of this, we're going to look at the basal nuclei as one example. So we know that the basal nuclei helps regulate voluntary motor activity. What we're really talking about is skeletal muscle activity. It also regulates attention and cognition, and in terms of skeletal muscle activity, it puts the brake on unnecessary skeletal muscles. So think about it this way. Whenever you move, there are some muscles contracting and some relaxing. What the basal nuclei does is kind of smooths out the movement. It cuts down a little bit on unnecessary muscle activity, which would cause that movement not to be smooth. So if that's the case, then one would think if there are damage to the basal nuclei, then it might affect movement. And that's the case. We're going to look at these two examples where damage to the basal nuclei occurs. The first one is called Parkinson's disease, and this affects between 1 and 1.5 million Americans. The problem in Parkinson's disease is that people can't take the brake off. Okay, so can't take the brake off. And as a result, there's absence or difficulty with intended movements. Okay, so again, there's damage to the basal nuclei such that people have a trouble taking the brake off. That's one way to think about it. Now the reason for this, if we could look down to the cellular level, is that it's not the basal nuclei that are being damaged, but the neurons that synapse with them. So it's the connecting neurons. And these connecting neurons release dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that helps potentiate the action potential to the basal nuclei. So the cause is, again, damage to these dopamine-releasing neurons. That interact with the basal nuclei. And the reason I'm writing it across the screen here is this is the basis of the problem, whether it's Huntington's disease or whether it's Parkinson's disease. Now, all neurons rely on regular communication with other neurons. In other words, regular action potentials in order to stay healthy. So as the dopamine releasing hormones are damaged, they stop sending as many action potentials, the frequency gets less, and the basal nuclei begin to deteriorate. And eventually they are destroyed. And that's where the problem comes from. Now, why is that happening is another question. And it has been a question for a while with Parkinson's disease. There have been a lot of theories, but there's growing evidence now that the cause of the damage to these dopamine-releasing neurons is environmental exposures. In fact, the cumulative environmental exposures that one receives over a lifetime. I'm just going to write ENV. And this is only true for Parkinson's disease. Okay, so it looks like the cause is cumulative environmental exposures received over a lifetime. Now, what kinds of exposures are we talking about? Well, it could be environmental toxins, but it can also be other things you're exposed to. For example, disease, alcohol, drugs, either pharmaceutical or recreational drugs, even things like isolation. Someone who is isolated and doesn't have a lot of social interaction, depression. We could go on, lack of intellectual stimulation, immobility. All of these things combined seem to cause damage to the dopamine-releasing hormones. And the symptoms of, dopamine-releasing neurons. The symptoms, of course, are lack or absence with intended movements, but you also see tremor, you can see rigidity, and bradykinesia, which means slow movements. So Parkinson's disease strikes one in their 60s or older, and there's a lot of people who have it. Huntington's disease, on the other hand, only affects about 30,000 Americans. And the problem is that you can't put the brakes on. Okay, can't put the brakes on. And so what happens is you get excessive unwanted movements. Sometimes those movements have been described as dance-like movements, where people are kind of throwing their arms and their legs in the air. And in fact, Huntington's disease used to be called Huntington's chorea, and that's short for choreography, which choreography is basically the steps that you take for a dance. Now, the cause here is genetic. So it is not environmental exposures, it's genetic, and it is an autosomal dominant mutation. The symptoms are, as we said above, excessive unwanted movement. So you can see above, dementia occurs a little sooner than it does in Parkinson's. In Parkinson's disease, dementia usually happens later in the progression of the disease. but in Huntington's it's sooner, and also Huntington strikes people sooner in life, in their 30s and the 40s. So this is just an example of one nuclei found in the brain and what we know about it. But there are many of these nuclei. In fact, if you look in your textbook, you'll see that they are color-coded. So one way to study the brain is to learn its functions based on the regions of the brain. So scientists have divided the brain into 4 regions: the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon. So the cerebral hemispheres is this large tan-colored part, kind of like the top of a mushroom. The diencephalon is the purple part hidden underneath. The brainstem, which is like the green part, like the stem of a mushroom. And lastly, the cerebellum, kind of tucked at the back of the brain. So let's start with the cerebral hemispheres because they seem to make up most of the brain. Now a little bit of grammar here. You can say cerebral hemispheres, in which cerebral is an adjective, so it's describing hemispheres. Or you can just say cerebrum, which means the same thing, only this is a noun. So cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres means the same thing. There are 2 cerebral hemispheres, one on the right and one on the left. And you can see they make up more than half of the mass of the brain. On the cerebral hemispheres, you will see these little ridges. And you can see down here, these little ridges. A ridge is called a gyrus. Now a gyrus is singular, and gyri is plural. There are also these shallow little cracks, and sulcus is singular, while sulci is plural. And then sometimes you have these really deep cracks, which is called a fissure. So this is a human brain. We are looking superiorly above, and on this side of the brain here, on the right side, they've removed a lot of the blood vessels. And so you can see the sulci, you can see the gyri, and the sulci in between. On this side of the brain, you can see that the blood vessels run within these sulci. This happens to be a pretty big fissure. It runs right down the center of the brain. This would be considered what kind of a section? Do you remember? This would be a sagittal section. This is called the longitudinal fissure. But there are other fissures in the brain. Remember, these are deep grooves that separate the cerebrum into lobes. So the first lobe is called the frontal lobe. And of course, the frontal lobe is underneath which bone? Well, if you guessed the frontal bone, you would be correct. There is the parietal lobe. Under the parietal bones, there's the occipital lobe. And then there is the temporal lobe. So here we have a sagittal section of the brain, and you can see the cerebral hemisphere right here. You can see some white matter. This white matter is called the corpus callosum. It's responsible for communication between the right and the left hemispheres. You are going to find that on the sheep brain and the human brain. So if we're looking at the cerebrum, you'll notice that there's this outer gray matter called the cerebral cortex. Again, remember, a cortex means the outside of an organ. The cerebral cortex is about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. And remember, it consists of neuron cell bodies, mainly. It's responsible for sensation, communication, memory, understanding, voluntary movements, a lot. Each hemisphere of the cerebrum acts contralaterally. And contralateral means opposites. So that means that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. The hemispheres are not equal in their function. We're going to see in a minute that one hemisphere is stronger in certain areas than the other. However, when anyone is conscious, all parts of the cortex are active and involved. So we said that each hemisphere has abilities not shared with his partner, and this is something called lateralization. There is a term, cerebral dominance, And cerebral dominance designates the hemisphere dominant for language, math, and logic. Okay, so for example, 90% of people are left cerebral dominant. That means in 90% of their people, the left hemisphere controls language, math, and logic. The left hemisphere. So again, cerebral dominance, if the left hemisphere controls language, math, and logic, you would say, I am left cerebral dominant. If you are left cerebral dominant, then that means that the right hemisphere controls visual spatial skills, emotions, and artistic skills. Visual spatial skills include, among other things, reading body language in someone's face. So that is the case, and it does turn out that most people who are left cerebral dominant are right-handed. Sometimes the roles are reversed. Sometimes, in 10% of the people, they are right cerebral dominant. And that means that the right hemisphere is responsible for or controls language, math, and logic, the right. And the left hemisphere controls visual spatial skills, emotion, artistic skills. Sometimes people in the past have called this cerebral confusion, these people who are right cerebral dominant, but there really isn't any confusion. It's kind of a biased term. Although sometimes there's a slightly higher incidence of dyslexia in people who are right cerebral